Second lecture in the Interface series in Science and Theology. Whether you're joining us here in person tonight or online, we're really glad to have you with us. My name is David Robinson. I'll be the host this evening, and I'm the project co-leader for Regent Interface. I'm also the incoming R. Paul Stevens Assistant Professor of Marketplace Theology and Leadership here. And for marketplace leaders today, it's increasingly important to engage with environmental ethics. Investors are screening for ESG criteria, which means they're looking for a higher standard of environmental, social, and governance practices. Business leaders are asking about sustainability, both in terms of the institutions they lead and the natural world in which these institutions take their place. Politicians have been seeking creative ways to support renewable energy and decrease fossil fuel emissions. In fact, Tuesday in Vancouver, our Canadian Prime Minister and Environment Minister announced their ambitious climate plan. So we've timed tonight's lecture so that Niels could respond to this latest announcement. As the Globe and Mail reports, their plan has, quote, laid bare the unprecedented degree of urgency and nimbleness that will be required of the government itself and of all the country's major economic sectors to have any real chance of reducing national emissions as promised. An unprecedented degree of urgency and nimbleness. Such is surely also required of the marketplace theologian. But as marketplace theologians, we don't only take our bearings from the marketplace. That's why last night we went deep into Christology, engaging with questions from Chalcedon in light of evolutionary science. And that's very appropriate, I should add, for an evangelical school to be about Jesus. Today we have the privilege of considering how ecological theology, or eco-theology, can ground us in order to address these urgent social questions. And tonight's distinguished speaker will be a brilliant guide for us in that. Again, for tonight's event, we're grateful to have the support of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS, and especially its program, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion. Before Dr. Gregersen is introduced and speaks tonight, let me give a few instructions about how the evening will proceed. Dr. Gregersen will speak for approximately 55 minutes, after which we'll have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A. I'll give directions for both in-person and online questions at that time, but feel free to be formulating them in your mind as the lecture goes on, because there will be a chance for engagement there. And there'll also be a chance to meet Dr. Gregersen and see his books at North America's best theological bookstore just outside this door. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Ross Hastings, who will introduce our speaker. Professor Hastings is the Sangwoo Yutong Chi Professor of Theology here at Regent College and co-leader of Regent Interface with me. Over to you, Ross.
Thank you, David, for all of your hard work in making this event possible. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Niels Gregersen. We just had dinner together and found much community of interest, both with respect to grandchildren and soccer, and more importantly, theology and science. A delightful conversation, so it's very good to have you with us. Dr. Gregersen is the Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Copenhagen. He is the author of several books and has edited 12 volumes in theology and the field of science and religion. Dr. Gregersen's research interests include science and religion with a focus on the significance of evolutionary theory and complexity studies, contemporary theology, especially the topics of creation and incarnation, philosophical and social anthropology, especially concerning risk-taking and generosity. Professor Gregersen was a leader of the Danish Science Theology Forum, the vice president of the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology, and a founding executive committee member and trustee for the International Society of Science and Theology. He also represented the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Denmark and the Lutheran World Federation, and was chairperson of the board for the Institute of Ecumenical Research in Strasbourg. Professor Gregersen has been a fellow of the Center of Theological Inquiry at Princeton, the J.K. John Russell Fellow at the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, Berkeley, and a Boyle Lecturer. He lectures widely in Europe and the US and has been a keynote speaker at major conferences in South Africa, Australia, China, Japan, and South Korea. Pleasure to have you, Dr. Gregersen. Let's welcome him.
Thank you very much for the very warm words of welcome, and it's good to be here again. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here at Regent College and do the three interface lectures, of which this is the second one. It will be on an eco-theology of wondering, intervening, and enmeshment. And in a sense, I have tried to depict this on the first screen here, which is the upper one is the wild nature that dwarfs us, like the small people walking there. The other below we have, this is Ecology 1, and below we have Ecology 2, the cultured nature with the fields. And then, in a sense, we also have nature within ourselves, like a greening tree in our heads, surrounded by green stuff. Allow me to begin this lecture with an anecdote. In the midst of the 1990s, I took part in a research group on science and religion hosted by the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton. The group made a trip to the botanical garden outside of Philadelphia, and I happened to walk with the philosopher theologian Holmes Rolston, by the way, one of the main inspirers of ecological ethics. And we passed an espalier like this here, something like this here, and then he asked me, "Niels, do you like what you see?" A bit hesitant, I replied that, well, it looked fine to me, to which Holmes replied, "Don't you see, it is a crucified tree." Well, I didn't see the espalier quite that way, I had to admit, since I do not assume that the tree is in pain like a human being hanged up on a cross. And over lunch, this incident led to a heated debate about the values of gardening versus the values of wilderness. Holmes Rolston, the American, spoke up for wilderness, as he had done in Philosophy Gone Wild, whereas the British physicist John Polkinghorne pointed to the values of gardening. Polkinghorne got the last word by finally almost shouting at Holmes, "Holmes, why do you cut your hair?" I agree nonetheless with Holmes Rolston that wilderness, what I call Ecology 1, does something to us that the garden cannot, neither the tamed Baroque garden or the wild romantic garden. It is the mountains, the wilderness, the desert, the animals, the oceans that dwarf ourselves and bring us out of our hinges, thereby shaking our self-understanding as human beings in control. But I do not view cultural landscapes, what I call Ecology 2, like a sort of rape. Rather, I see them as examples of a morally legitimate intertwining of nature and culture, without which, by the way, we would not have survived to this day. Pruning trees, tilling the soil, planting and harvesting the fruits is not a violation of nature, but I see it as a channeling of the powers of growth, which is built into the nature around us as well as in ourselves. Such tilling of the garden is not quite dissimilar to the way in which children, teenagers, and grown-ups are continuously tilled and pruned within human communities, in families, among friends, and at the workplace. So, in this lecture then, my aim is to expand the repertoire of eco-theology so as to encompass not only the otherness of nature and human interactions with nature, but also to the nature that we ourselves are, being pervasively enmeshed in natural processes, what I call Ecology 3. I'm indebted to the work of anthropologists, including my Copenhagen colleague Cecilia Rubov, when proposing a map of 3 interrelated aspects of ecology. First, we have Ecology 1, which is about alterity. The environment as non-human, wild, raw, and potentially enchanted. Then we have Ecology 2, the cultured nature, the environment as cultured through landscapes, gardens, cities, and new technologies via human stewardship and also attempts of control. And then we have Ecology 3, human beings as so deeply enmeshed with nature that human beings themselves, we ourselves, are decentered, but also potentially recapacitated as human agents. As I hope to show during this lecture, the conceptual matrix of Ecology 1, 2, and 3 should not be taken as a taxonomy in the strict sense, that is, either Ecology 1 or Ecology 2 or Ecology 3, but rather as an open typology where the 3 aspects of ecology are interwoven rather than falling into 3 distinct departments. But from this typology, I believe that a map of 3 different but intertwined ethical commitments emerge. We have first an aesthetics of inspiration. We saw it already yesterday in the discussion of biology, seeing the biological work as a source of aesthetic inspiration, but also an ethics of human self-withdrawal from environmental exploitation in relation to the otherness of nature. We have second also an ethics of care, but also, I would say, an ethics of intervention that is aware of the need for human care for the values of nature, as well as for legitimate human self-protection from natural environment in Ecology 2. So I think we have to say it is not only humans who are evil to nature, it is actually also nature that sometimes does very much harm to us. And third, we have an ethics of entanglement, very much more difficult to disentangle. And such ethic builds on a sense of appreciation of natural processes as a source of resonance, something that we can resonate with, that we can understand beyond a recent argument. Then we are in tune with it. We are like tapping into relations which are pre-existing before us, and these resonance relations go into ourselves. But also here we have to acknowledge the conflicts and dissonances within the ecological nexuses in which we as human beings are part. I will take COVID-19 as one example in this regard. My own view is that we should learn to think with nature, as it were, thus leaving space for the independent voices of nature, including other species and organisms. Species and organisms that have interests that differ from our own human interests. Ecology 1. Yet in our ecological thinking, we also have to do justice what are legitimate human interests, not least the need for survival as one species amongst others. Cultured Culturing Nature in Human Stewardship, Ecology 2, is not something intrinsically problematic, I think, even though human stewardship and care is indeed a mixed bag involving both a mandate to care for the intrinsic value of nature, that is, before our valuing it has an intrinsic value. It may be us who actually are making the value statements, but so to speak, our values statements do not end in ourselves. They are not curved into ourselves, but are actually about something else. So we have to let nature speak with its own voices, but again, we have an unavoidable element of a human control of nature. And when I say this almost repeatedly as a mantra, it is because it is not so often said in eco-theological discussions. So I have some inspirers and some interlocutors in this projects about how we can think in these three ecologies. And I think that we should always take seriously the pervasive role of nature in human life itself, because we ourselves are part of the wool and woof of natural self-development. So Ecology 3 is important for understanding the role of humanity in nature. And with the German sociologist, and I have here my three interlocutors. The one to the left is Hartmut Rosa, the German sociologist, who has written a wonderful big book called Resonance, also translated into English and even into Danish. And another small book, if you can't manage the 800 pages book that it is, then he has written a small book, only 100 pages, called The Uncontrollability of the World, which in a sense encapsulates his thinking. On the right side, I have K.E. Løgstrup, a Danish philosopher theologian, who was very early into the eco-theological thinking already in the early 1970s, together with some of his students. And he is the one who actually undertook a so-called cosmophenomenological analysis of how the world impinges on our self-understanding. As he pointed out in the opening section of his book, Source and Surrounding, with our respiration and our metabolism, we are emplaced in the cycle of nature. Everyone would say that. And then he continues, with our sensation, we are emplaced in the universe, meaning that when I'm seeing something, or when I'm hearing something, it is in my ears. And when I'm touching something, it is actually, I'm touched by it myself. Of course, when I'm seeing something, then I'm seeing it on a distance, because my body is here and what I see is so far away. But if you really look at a thing, it is not a question about distance. Sensation it has some distance-less qualities, as he says. So when K. Løgstrup speaks of the universe, he does not speak of the stars in the heavens, but he speaks about the pervasive features of the world in which we ourselves are embedded and enmeshed. That is what I call Ecology 3. His point was that sensation is prior to our language descriptions of the universe, since the former, the sensation, offers, so to speak, the raw stuff for consciousness and understanding to develop. So the world is there to us before we begin to speak about the world. Løgstrup and Rosa are two important interlocutors for my way of developing the concept of Ecology 3. We thus live our life in a wealth of resonance experiences with nature, but we also experience a wealth of dissonance and tension, sometimes even discrepancies. Human societies do therefore need to perform human actions also against nature regarding its particular harmful aspects. Disasters and diseases, and I will come back to this in my third lecture tomorrow, reveal the wealth of dissonance between human culture and nature, which I think that we cannot or should not neglect in our ecological thinking. While creation theologians and philosophers helpfully remind us that there is something ineradicable, pre-cultural, as K. Løgstrup calls it, about natural conditions, social philosophers such as Jane Bennett, my third interlocutor, helpfully reminds us that we already live and breathe in a world of vibrant matter, as her book is called, full of diversity and conflict. So I'm very interested also in picking up eco-philosophers that do not have any specific Christian orientation, though she is actually being willing to enter into a Danish project on eco-theology, of which I'm part, but has this sense that there's something ongoing there. We live in a steady influx of things before we have an efflux of things. And still so, nature is not it is full of diversity and conflicts. So she's aware of that. So two things is important for me. Someone who says that that the world is impinging on us, not externally, but into ourselves. And also some who say, well, that is not without its problems. We have to be aware of that. But even if there indeed exists pre-political ecological realms, which also sets the agenda for an eco-sensitive ethics and politics, there exists no pre-ecological home for human agency in this world. There is no other planet than ours, no planet B for us in this world. So far, I have argued that we in our ecological thinking and ethical reflections will have to face how the three ecologies intersect with one another, and also that we cannot choose the one as the more important over the others. Eco-theologists too have to develop a sense for the interlacing of the three ecologies without giving moral priority to only one of the three ecologies, such as wilderness or gardening, or the fact that we are part of it all. If you just say we are part of it all, why then actually make a specific stewardship vis-a-vis nature? And how do we take care of ourselves as human communities? And my point is here also that these three ecologies is like a common place. They are, in a sense, something that is discussed on the marketplace, to use the term used by Professor David Robinson before. So, Christians, think about something which is coming to all of us, but may have something distinct, some added values to bring to the field. So it's about both things, accepting that we have common problems, and that we do not have a Christian solution to everything. And at the same time saying we may have something that is interesting to say in these regards also to other people who do not share Christian beliefs. At this junction, let me bring in the work of the French anthropologist and eco-thinker Bruno Latour, who does not shy away from discussing theological thought models. Latour has rightly pointed to the watershed of what he calls the modern constitution that took place in the period between 1650 to 1850 and led to what he diagnoses as the cross-out God, This already came up in his early book, which was very inspirational to me, called We Have Never Been Moderns. His point was that we never were moderns. We were just taught to be moderns, but we couldn't live our ordinary life on that assumption. What happened in the modern constitution, so LECTURE, was the establishment of a dichotomy between nature and culture, so that nature is what lies prior to our social constructions, whereas everything in society is up to our own free social constructions. So the verdict of the modern constitution says, and now I quote, "Nature and society must remain absolutely distinct. The work of purification must remain absolutely distinct from the work of mediation," end quote. Nonetheless, such a simple thing like baking a bread does exemplify a mediation between nature and culture. The seeds of grain are sown within a cultural system on the field, just as the formative powers of yeast are at work in the midst of human bakeries, as they are actually also in our own bodies. By this framework, nature plus culture fills out the spectrum of immanence according to the modern constitution, whereas God is relegated to a purely transcendent realm of oblique otherness. And this is what I have tried to depict there. It is my own scheme. I hope it is understandable. And I quote first LECTURE himself. "God becomes the cross-out God of metaphysics, as different from the pre-modern God of the Christians, because at that time, God was part of the whole game, and as different from the nature constructed in a laboratory, because also there we do not have God. God is crossed out. In this constitution, God may be, the cross-out God may be the creator of the world of nature. This is what we see on the left side. God is creator. That is what we believe, isn't it? Yes. Nature, so this is a domain of divine creativity. But it is, on this constitution, not revealing God. Nature is, so to speak, mute. Conversely, if a divine self-revelation were to take place, it has to fall exclusively within the human realm of culture or the individual human soul. So what we see here is also a dichotomy between the extended body and the res cogitans with all its cultural associates. Now, what is the alternative to this view? Well, no one should make wooden images of the divine, but here's an alternative which I believe is closer to the earlier Christian intuitions as well as to contemporary religious sensitivities. It is simply easier for a person like me, who has been taught into that theme, against natural theology and saying that revelation is something that only appears to somebody, but it makes it more easy to understand theology and actually how to speak about God. This is a depiction of such wooden image, as I must admit. This view suggests, broadly speaking, a panentheism, the view that all that exists within a divine infinity. But it does not suggest a pantheism which identifies God and the universe, the creator and the world of creation. In this view, in the inner circle, humanity is part and parcel of the natural nexuses, much like in Ecology 3. Individual human beings are persons of clay, even in our cultural inventiveness. Accordingly, no culture exists apart from its nexus with nature. Our houses are built by clay, with clay too, and within them We do not only have plants and pets, but also dust and many other animals, microbes and mites, spiders and ants, as we know. And likewise, in our stomachs, we host millions of bacteria, virus, and algae, who are our friends, though we tend to think of them as the usual suspects as soon as we get ill. And so they also are. They are not only our friends, but also our foes. As a matter of fact, we live ourselves in a constant interweaving of what is natural and what is cultural. Therefore, we have the line going both ways. This view does not cross God out from the cosmos, since divine infinity is pervasive in all that is and around everything. God is the encompassing one, as the philosopher Karl Jaspers called it. God ist das Umgreifende, as is said in German. In this view, you may say that God is certainly coextensive with the material world and all its configurations. But at the same time, God is crisscrossing our immense, though finite, cosmos on the one hand, and the persistent divine self-identity, or what we might call transcendence. So transcendence is not only about being elsewhere, but it's about being persistent, having a persistent identity, whatever happens. I think this is what is meant by saying that God is love. It is a persistent quality under all circumstances. So there are not two gods, a transcendent God and then an immanent one. Not even are there two separate aspects of God, but there's only one living God crisscrossing our constructions of a God beyond, in contrast to the God of clay, or the God as incarnate, as interweaved with the material cosmos in which we live. This was the theme of yesterday's lecture. So one could say that only one is worthy to be called God, and this is the God who stretches from the highest to the lowest in order to reach the creatures, where we are most vulnerable and shaky in our existence, that is, on our way to extinction. If incarnation is about a divine reaching down into the dangerous and risky nexus of creatures, even into death and annihilation, so the Christian understanding of God as Trinity, all specifics taken aside, is about the eternal divine capacity for stretching between the Father in the heavens, as it were, as the source of all that exists, to the eternal Son, or the Logos, who is pervasive in the nexus of creation, divesting himself into the nexus of creation, but always mediated by the Spirit as a life-giving span between the Father and the eternal Son, before, under, and after the incarnation in Jesus Christ. So this is a very, in a sense, theological, dogmatic statement, but it's also very simple. It's about a stretching and a reaching down, and God being the span, the Spirit. On this model, we may also approach what I, in my first lecture yesterday, called the basic this-that structure of Christology. As this Jesus lived, limited as he was to time and space. Thus is God everlasting, living at all places infinitely. But if so, Christology has ramifications for understanding the wider world, for the God present in the world is not only a spiritual principle existing alongside, as it were, the material world, but is committed to become blended, to become mixed with the material world that is becoming flesh. Accordingly, the Christian view of incarnation has repercussions for the Christian view of creation. Just as Jesus was addressing his fellows and followers, so God is addressing his creatures in similar manners, not only in the lifetime of Jesus of Nazareth 2,000 years ago, but both before and after, as the divine word and wisdom, the Logos Sophia, expressing divine presence and guidance since the beginning of creation, also in all the particulars of creation, in all the individual organisms, systems, and so on. At least this is a high expectation released by the Christian emphasis on incarnation, that God is living in this material world, and which is at once material and a universe, as we call it, but also pluriform in all its expressions of life, and often confusingly so from a human perspective. Metaphorically speaking, the Jesus story sets the cue that makes it possible to hear the divine music in the cosmos at large. So we have to hear the cue, the particular, the concrete, and then in order to be able to listen to the bigger pictures. Now the question is then, what can we say about eco-theology in theological perspective? I would begin again with something very simple, not something very creedal. It is that things exist. And things exist prior to our conceptualization of them. We may use the term a dog as an umbrella term for variegated species covering more than 200 breeds, but still so, a Doberman Pinscher is different from a beagle, which is different from a Pekingese. But not only that, each individual differs from others within the breed, just as any mountain differs from any other mountain. There is an irreducible thisness to each organism and aggregate, distinguished by time and place. But not only that, also distinguished by shape and colors, size and weight, and many other general descriptions, such as, in the case of dog, character. Each dog has its own character, its own habits, and much more like that. This such and suchness of each creature that Duns Scotus called its hesetas may have some generalizable properties, so that we could talk about dogs, but each particular organism or system remains something unique. Seeing the unique is part of Ecology 1. Such uniqueness of individual things persists, even if things are undergoing constant change, as all things are, also a Pekingese or a Doberman Pinscher, and even if we can never set a fixed line between an organism and its environment. This is how it is. But Ecology 1 also aims to take seriously the such and suchness of each creature as an individual, as a concrete assemblage, as a wider system. But there's also something more to it, which is that nature is always informed. Information matters, such and suchness matters. Everything that exists takes a variety of forms, shapes, and constellations. From a scientific perspective, the case can be made for the view that not only mass and energy, but also information matters causally as well as ontologically. This becomes particularly evident in the case of the oscillating features of physical resonance that are at work, whether or not we take notice of them on sound and light, shape and form, amplitudes and wavelengths characterize the world of nature. And in resonance experiences, we therefore also experience a constant crisscrossing of human and non-human forms of agency. This nature is somehow speaking to us, because it's different from us in its pre-cultural, raw or wild form. And so we are called to respond and read the messages of nature, not necessarily by having a lot of opinions on them, but if you are walking a couple of days in the mountains, you don't have many meanings, but still you have a very strong sense of where you are, and that there is an otherness surrounding you. This is also part of classic Christian thinking, namely of the idea of the book of nature. The idea of the book of nature, larger in scope than the book of the Bible, but less clear than it, can be traced from the early church fathers like Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, into the Middle Ages, and to the reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin, and further on to the birth of modern physics in Galileo and Copernicus. The idea is here that nature speaks to humans through its beauty and orderliness, which actually all human people would be able to see and appreciate if we only could open our senses for it without being incurved in ourselves, or simply being so busy that we don't realize the world in which we are. This idea of the book of nature also finds a Christological basis in the so-called cosmic exemplarism of the divine logos or wisdom. The idea being that logos is actually the source of all informational structures in the universe, just as God's wisdom is expressed in many, many ways. Behind this notion, which is this exemplarism, which comes up in the Middle Ages, we have it in Bonaventure, as I will show in a while, but we also have it actually in Thomas Aquinas. Behind this notion lies also a biblical wisdom theology. God's wisdom is multiformed or multifarious or multicolored, full of shape of colors. Sophia polypoikilos, which means multicolored, as the Greek text says. In our Bible translation, it's just said the manifold wisdom, but it's much more sensual, much more color-oriented, actually, the term itself. According to the great Franciscan theologian Bonaventure, living from 1217 to 1274, the face of Christ is present in each and any creature. Every creature is thus an example or an instantiation of Christ, the wisdom, who is the generative form of all forms in creation. This is what exemplar means. It does not mean being just one copy among others, but the exemplar is the creative, generative pattern that creates all kinds of patterns in the universe and everywhere. So the face of the multiform wisdom is in the vestiges of the divine works, Bonaventure says in his commentary to Genesis. Likewise, Martin Luther, living from 1483 to 1546, emphasized that God's word of creation is active at any moment. So Christ is actually active as creator at any moment. And divine creativity is more about novelty than about maintenance. To create is always to make something new, Luther says. Moreover, since God is creatively present in the midst of the world of creation, God is continuously addressing his creatures by way of other creatures, whom he can also call words of God. So in his lecture on Genesis, Luther can say that God does not speak grammatical words like professors, pastors, politicians, and other talkative persons do. God is rather speaking with words of silence so that eventually new beings and relations come forth. And then comes the quote, sun, moon, heaven, earth, Peter, Paul, I, you, etc. We are all words of God. In fact, only a single syllable or letter by comparison to the entire creation. It's rather wild, because this is not what I learned about Martin Luther in the textbooks that I read when I was a student. You see, it's wild. He's not saying that it's not about a rational theology, natural theology, but he's just saying that if Christ is everywhere, then the face shines up. This is Bonaventure. And Luther puts it away that there are many small words, and you are actually some of them, but not the only ones. Also the Son, and so on. And he can, even in his interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus speaks about the lilies in the field and the birds in the air, Luther can say, and this is again a quotation, he says, we have as many teachers as preachers as we have small birds in the air. So probably there will be more teachers and preachers in the air than in any pulpit, in all the pulpits of this world, but because so many birds there are. And so he can say that the whole world is full of Bible. And he can say many other things, that every moment God is knocking on our ears with the beauty, and we don't see it because we are sinners. And if we only had faith, then we could see the reign of God in a kernel of a peach, and hear it where in the workplace of the craftsmen. His point is, of course, then we don't have faith to see it, but it is all there. There's a knocking on our senses in every moment. This sense of ecology, however, does not imply that nature is only a rosary affair. Nature is also a source nature is also a source that invites us into resonant experiences, but also entails limit experiences, something that we cannot really understand, that contravenes us, that we cannot cope with. Nature remains the alien, which acts on us precisely by its alien frequencies, which might well charge up our minds, but which cannot fully invite us into ourselves without destroying us. This is why we prefer to experience the surface of the sea, often standing safely on the seashore, rather than experiencing the depths of the sea. We prefer to enjoy the sea rather than drowning. We would rather let our breath be challenged by the winds than be swept away by the force of hurricanes. But there are both things in nature. Now we then come to ecology 2. Eco-theologies based on ecology 1 tend to argue that human engagements with nature should be kept at an absolute minimum in order not to infringe nature's otherness and beauty. Accordingly, human stewardship is about staying back, and there's much truth in such ascetic human willingness of self-withdrawal. However, stewardship is not only about cultivating, it's not about self-withdrawal alone, it's also about cultivating reciprocal relations between nature and culture that makes nature and humanity flourish together. The eco-theologian Calvin de Witt has given a very appealing interpretation of the biblical concept of stewardship. In Genesis 2:15, Adam receives the task of both tilling and keeping the earth. The tilling, in Hebrew, abad, points to a cultivating or tending service which takes an active form, maybe even a rough form. The keeping of the earth is in the Hebrew expressed by shamar, the same word used in the Aaronitic blessing, the Lord bless you and shamar you. It's the same word in Genesis 2:15 as in the Aaronitic blessing. This emphasizes the blessing of letting nature be what it is, non-human, fresh in its otherness. Many have, of course, argued that this emphasis on human molding and keeping the earth gives human a quasi-divine task vis-à-vis our natural conditions. However, as de Witt emphasizes, there is a reciprocal giving and taking in human stewardship. Service by creation to people must be reciprocated with service back to creation. Stewardship does not allow taking without giving back. Instead, it returns creation service with returned human service that is given in appreciation, gratitude, and care, quotation end. I think that we in our time need to think more about stewardship also in a longitudinal perspective in terms of planning. We need to have a concern for future generations, not only for humans. And I see very interesting ecological initiative taken in this regard, such as the phenomenon of rewilding. It may be that you don't need it here in Canada because you have so much wilderness already. But in Denmark, we have just made 12 new national parks. One is actually beginning only 300 meters from our home in Denmark. We like the idea, but we don't really like it, at least not all in the community, because that means that we do not have unrestricted access to the wood. So there will be only few places where we can go in, and elks will be reintroduced just as beavers already has been it. And will this not be dangerous for us? And then new problems come that we will put them in some large fences. But then if they are starving, should we then let them die? This is what happens in nature. Or should we say, well, we actually have to keep them alive? So there is an active shamar there also in the wilderness. So this is a wilderness too. It's a wilderness. And I think it's a good idea, but we do not need to be all too romantic about it either. But it's good for the general biodiversity, not only for the elks, but also for everything else. So I think it's very worthwhile doing. And of course, tree is not only timber. So it has a value in itself. And this is what there is a good understanding for. We now come to I will skip the one on resonance experiences, even if I always love to talk about that. I'll talk more about it tomorrow afternoon in a seminar. But now I will go to Eco-theology 3, Ecology 3 in theological perspective. The point of Ecology 3 is that it, by definition, is a pervasive reality, a sort of material continuity, though a continuity that is always granulated, formed, and informed. But it is something that, by definition, cannot be defined. Humans do not only plant, prune, harvest, use habitats as testing labs for our purposes. We are ourselves testing labs for natural selection too. Constantly we are pruned, gardened, attacked by the pervasive forces of nature that do not stop at our skin. We are here approaching the important but difficult to define themes of Ecology 3, our entanglement with nature as a pervasive dimension of our creatureliness. The German language has a useful distinction between the body as a purely physiological entity, a Körper, and a living body. A living body interprets its world, in its environment, that we breathe in and breathe out and interact with. While the physiological body is place-bound, I'm here, you are there. The living body is a vital body that has a time-space extension, so we are here together. And we can think about other things which are not here present in this room, especially if the lecture is too boring. And that is fine. So we live in this life, means that we have these extensive relationships. The German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, he has put it as follows: we are beings of flow, Schwebewesen, before we become living beings, Lebewesen. In a sense, we are even living beings in order to become even more fluid beings. We begin our lives as floating fetuses in the womb of our mother and continue to be living and floating creatures until we shall eventually, so the eschatological vision of Christian faith, float into the life of God. This happens by grace, we say, and in Hebrew, the word for grace, rechem, is very tellingly the same as is used of the female womb from which all new life starts. Peter Sloterdijk is not very interested in, he has a love-hate relationship to religion and also to Christianity. But he's very worthwhile reading. And he says one of the most beautiful things in religions is the idea that we actually are floating beings and that we come into a world and that we are welcomed in this world, which is exactly the point of creation theology. What is important to Ecology 3 in my interpretation is not only the pervasive nature of the natural, but also the central role of human beings as evolutionary creatures. We have a 4E anthropology emerging. We are first ecologically enmeshed, 2 evolutionary developed, 3 socially embedded, and then forever embodied persons as Leiber, as living beings. Lifelong, we live and thrive by absorbing resonances and overcoming dissonances as long as our life story goes. Think of the term persona in Latin. It probably originally means the crack in our masks or the face open to the world through which sounds and tones, sona, can flow in and out per, and which therefore forms our individual character. Accordingly, I propose to see human beings and any other similar organisms as persons, through which all the sounds and voices of the world flow, which while we ourselves also give sound and voice back to the world, each from our individual perspective. If we try to think this idea through, then think about all that has filled us up. It's not just other people. It's not just culture, art, and things like that, which are nice. But also nature has left its footprints in us. The wind and the sun rays, the dog and its barking, the insects and the buzzing belong to our humanity. Sound, smells, and sensual touches are part of our lives, whether we like the smells, sounds, and touches or not. It is there prior to us and actually moving into us. In the same manner, we carry within us, for our bodies are examples of nature, things that are around us. Why is our blood red? Because blood carries the iron content formed by stellar explosions billions of years ago. Similarly, we have the entire biological history of the species represented in our bodies in the small selection of the biological genome handed over to us at conception. But more than that, we carry with us on our skin and in our throats and stomachs a vast amount of DNA and RNA in our non-human microbiome. So the most genetic material in us is not human, but it's actually lying in our stomachs. It is consisting of bacterial DNA, viral RNA, fungal forms without which we could not survive one day. We couldn't digest our food, for example. Even viewed as vital physical bodies, Körper, we are interwoven into natural networks. But even more so, we are enmeshed in our world as living and interpreting bodies, Leiber. Just take one example, which is the COVID-19 vaccines. First of all, we have an exposure to something which is out there in nature. But what we are doing in vaccination is actually that we are reinserting small portions of that potentially lethal stuff, but so small doses that actually we are training our immune systems to be able to resist further infections. We are training our immune systems by way of nature itself. So I'm now coming to a conclusion, which is very short and brief. But the point is, first of all, that creation faith implies that we are welcomed into this world. This is God's world and not a foreign territory. Faith in Christ, then, suggests that we are constantly encountering Christ in the many granting or accommodating experiences of this world. And we are constantly weaved into his spiritual and material body. Faith in the Holy Spirit similarly means that God will accomplish our lives with one another and with nature in God's reign. We are not saved from this world, but with this world. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Professor Gregersen, for a very rich and interesting lecture. We'll have plenty to engage over the next 20 minutes. We're going to move into a question period now. I'd invite you, if you'd like, to stand while I give instructions, just to give yourself a short break. And let me describe how this will take place. So if you would like to ask a question, I'd invite you to proceed up to one of the two microphones at the back of the chairs there. And when you ask the question, if you could just speak very closely to the microphone and give it concisely if possible. If you are joining us online, you're also welcome to submit a question. Please email us at questions, plural, questions at regent-college.edu. That's questions at regent-college.edu. Let's begin. Graham, I see you at the microphone there. Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gregersen, for this lecture. It was quite brilliant, very illuminating. We're grateful to have received it. My question relates around the theme of place.
The theme of grace.
Place.
Of place.
Yeah, so I think you kind of make mention to kind of the phenomenology of the person with kind of invocation of Husserl and Sloterdijk. And I think, of what it means to be me as my person. I think of growing up in West Michigan, so I think of dunes, and I can't think of who I am without those dunes, so to speak.
Graham, please speak a little more slow, because it goes very fast, and I can hardly hear it.
Yeah, I'll be slower then, sorry. My apologies. So I think of what it is to be, my own person, and I think of the biological communities that I've inhabited as somehow constituting the very person that I am in some kind of way. And there I kind of highlight perhaps a perichoretic logic that as much as I intend the world in my mind, it counterbalances and brings in and interpenetrates my own self and shapes who I am as my own person. To transition then, I think of American thinkers like Wendell Berry and Bell Hooks, who talk about the biological communities they inhabit as very central.
A little more slow, please.
Oh, sorry again. To who they are as persons as well. And so, to be very brief then and slow, I wonder if a proper theology of place is necessary to tie together the three eco-theologies you bring together so that we can not treat the worlds we inhabit as abstract essences, but as personable in some sense, as hypostatic, to use that term.
I think that it's quite clear that the sense of space, sorry, not space, but place, you said, is very important, because we live in specific habitats that take place and only fill out a little space. But it is also, I would say, open-ended, so that we cannot say where our place stops. So Regent College, where does Regent College stop? Does it stop here at the building, but it's also part of University of British Columbia associated with that. It's here in Vancouver. It's related to other institutions and so on. But did you also ask about the personhood? Is that your question was also about the personhood?
Yeah, in a sense. It seems to me that place almost bears some kind of personal logic in the sense that I can identify it.
Yes.
Whereas
Yes.
world is more abstract.
Yes. Yes. So maybe it doesn't work to say that I'm just a timeline of that. Who I am is a timeline of all that has happened to me and that I have responded to in my life. But it would rather be saying that I have been absorbing different atmosphere, different influx from the people that have cared for me and that I have related myself to or the other way around. If you then also ask me about what does that has to do with theology, I mean, I think that in one way I like to see our lives as this kind of going up and going down and taking place in many different places, so that we are never only member of just one community. I am not only a Christian. I'm not saying that it's only an only thing. I'm just saying I'm not only a father or a husband or a teacher or a professor. So I have these different aspects of my life which all have different places also often. Then I would say that rather than saying that this is all I am, so to speak, the flux of my life, all that has come into me that I've been giving back. I also think it's very important from a theological perspective that I've not touched upon in this lecture today, that we in a sense also have a basic identity. And this basic identity does not need to be in another place, but it is an attributed, it's a given identity, which is not, which does not say that I do not mean that I have a fixed identity in myself, but it's attributed. It's actually under the divine promise that wherever I will go, I will be with you. So it's not only about me going around, but it's also about that there is something that goes with me. And that's a very strong, again, a Christological concept. See, I will be with you always until the end of the age. The last words of Matthew 28. So I would then, from a theological perspective, say that in a sense we have in a sense a twofold description of ourselves. One is in this mundane world with its ups and downs and all our trajectories, and that's very important because that is the raw stuff of my life. But then there is another dimension which Paul expresses the way that now it's no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. So I see it the way that in a sense we have a double constituted personhood, one by all our relational selves, and one by the attributed selves. So we are in a sense lying in a, what is it called? What is this form? A top? No, you don't say that. It's not a bathtub. What do you say? Schale auf Deutsch. Wir leben in einer Schale. Ja, was heißt das auf English? A ball. Yeah, we live in a ball. So we are actually living in different waters, and we are going through different territories. But the ball means, living in a ball means that there's always a sort of gravitational center to return to, and which is in a sense there at all the time. So we have this twofold identity of personhood. So I'm not sure I really have responded to what you asked for, Graham, because I've had difficulty to understand the details. But please go on if I have not.
Very generative, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to this microphone here.
Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed the quote by Martin Luther. My question is about God's revelation in nature versus God's revelation in Scripture.
Yeah.
So how do they interact? Do we need grace to see God's revelation in nature? Does it take faith? And is it supernatural? And if it is, how is it different than God's revelation in Scripture, which is to a specific people at a specific time in, the call of Abraham and the incarnation of Jesus?
How is it different? What I have said is, and what I think before you ask me, I would say the point of the Scripture is that it's clear. It has a clearer message than nature, which is a mixed bag, simply. So that is the easy answer. But you can also read Scripture without hearing anything or seeing anything. And then the question is, what are we as theologians doing with people who, first of all, are not very good readers, but are very good livers, who are not very fond of reading the Bible or any other text, but we can also say one who loves to read Shakespeare but not the Bible. I would just smile at him or her and then say, then wait, because we cannot press for anything. So I would not say that the Bible is a supernatural revelation and the nature is only natural, because also the Bible is is written by human hands, and people who have reflected, thought about that. Therefore, it's clearer than nature, and also particularly with respect to God, clearly. But I would not say that that is supernatural and the other thing is natural. In a sense, we could come back to the question raised at the lecture yesterday, actually by you, David. It was about about compatibilism. Things are both and. So I do not see anything in this world as belonging to a godless territory, which is only natural. And then we have something which is only divine, like Scripture. But I must admit that there are some places that are more speaking than others. But we also have to attend to the fact, because I live in a forest town, that many are really very much drawn into to nature, and not in a non-religious way. They understand nature as somehow speaking to them. It's related to, it's a presence of God for them. That is, for them is easier to understand than for example, the Bible.
Thank you.
But that's a psychological question, the last thing, but I think it's very important for the way in which things are handled. And I think one should never press for faith. One should just let it come and articulate a theology in such a way that faith is, in a sense, emerging as almost as natural as air.
Let's go with Drew Lewis at this microphone.
Thank you very much. I want to ask a question regarding your Eco-theology 1, or the way that you were describing that. I particularly want to play off the Luther's idea of like the birds being the preachers, and we can see some of that in Scripture itself, where Jesus talks about the rocks will cry or will sing praises to the God. I can't remember exactly the quote, but also Isaiah says the trees of the field will clap their hands, and showing
Yes.
how nature itself responds to God. That being said, that is nature responding to God. What is interesting to me as well is natural phenomena that are associated with God's self. So, for instance, the theophanies to the Israelites is when God is appearing in a cloud,
Yes.
right? And then playing off that, there is a theme, kind of a subgenre of poetry in the Old Testament called the storm theophany, where God appears in storms, fights battles in storms, and I'm asking this because it seems like a particularly relevant way of thinking about God acting or finding God in nature in an eco-theology in 2022, when when weather itself seems to be one of the foes that you were talking about with that. And I'm wondering if you have a response regarding that question.
Thank you very much. I mean, you are actually saying something that I should have, maybe also could have said to the earlier question, which is that we have a lot of nature expressions in Scripture itself. I mean, not only in the Sermon on the Mount, but also in Isaiah and in Job's book, and also that these do not have the form of something that can be easily comprehended, like Job asking, where were you when I was spanning the beginnings of everything? And of course, God speaking from a storm means that it is through the ambivalent experiences of nature that we are driven away from our, so to speak, ingrown habits, which often have a very secular, that's just what we do. So we are stopped in a sense. We are not only accommodated and granted, as I emphasize, but we are also, in a sense, contravened, contradicted. We are stopped. And I think that's a very beautiful what you are laying out there. Could I just add one thing then, because I just saw that the time has been running, so I skipped a section on resonance. But the important thing about resonance is, first of all, that there's physical resonance all around us, in sound, in wavelengths, in light, in gravity. Some of us have been into a magnetic resonance scanner, MR scanner. So we are actually, it's all over around us. Then we have resonance experiences, and it's always about tensions. So tensions are important for our life. We should not just clap our hands, or we should not just say no. We should experience the tensions. So if we have a guitar, then I'm giving it some extra energy by my finger and my pleasure. That's an external energy addition that then is transported by the strings, but it's absorbed by the internal so-called natural frequency of the body of the guitar. So there's always something external and something internal that actually has to vibrate, to come into vibration, have to come into tune with one another. So it's about tapping into those places where we have these resonance experiences, rather than just going on working harder and harder in order to make it and so on. We have to see that there's something that stops us, but also gives us something. So it's both things. And so what I started out saying, that nature is not only good, but also evil, then I maybe already there have been using too much of a moral language. You could just say that there are both tensions and invitations. There are both accommodation and granting, like grace. and there is also something that contravenes us, speaks against us, asks us to stop.
Let's take a question from our online audience. So Graham, if you could read that for us.
Yes.
This question comes from Greg, and he asks, your description of the three ecologies is understandably geocentric, and you said that there is no
Graham,
planet
can you
B
just
for
get a
us.
little closer to the mic? Thanks.
Sure.
Jordan, sorry.
Jordan.
Your description of the three ecologies is understandably geocentric, and you said there is no planet B for us. Yet in my former professional world of space exploration, scientists and even businesses are discussing the exploration and even colonization of the moon and Mars. Have you and others given thought to extending these ideas to the solar system and beyond? Does theology have analogous responsibilities and potentially things to learn along the lines you have discussed for Mars?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's a very challenging question. And of course, this is a good question to ask to me, because I've said we have no planet B for us. I think still we have to say we have no planet B for the world in which we live. I think that your colleague should think, I mean, I really understand it. I think that there will be other theologians like my good friend Ted Peters, who has written much about extraterrestrial life, but also about missions to other places. But I don't think that it will be there in the next 50 years or 100 years. And I don't think there will be very much of life on other planets. But if it happens, I would be happy. I think also that I would miss quite a lot of the world that we have here on planet A then. At least for my life, and I also think for most of you here in this room, even if you are only 25, there will not be a planet B.
Thanks for that question, Jordan, and Greg as well. We'll take our final two questions here. So first from Eric on this side, and then John on this side.
I guess I'm trying to make sense of the book of nature and the biblical witness and panentheism and Luther's sense of in, with, and under. I'm an Anglican, and you know what I believe about the Eucharist is that there's this moment where bread and wine somehow are also simultaneously the body and blood of Christ, and that the Christ is really present. The bread and the wine never cease to be bread and wine. I don't believe in transubstantiation. Their materiality maintains, and yet somehow Christ is also really present. I'm wondering if that can be analogous to some of what you're saying around deep incarnation.
Oh, yes.
And the presence of Christ in, with, and under the creature later. So I guess it is I'm wondering about the sacramentality of the world.
Yes, no.
And then our capacity to read that.
And that's a very important question. I tend to like to think about sacraments as something specific. I just wrote an article about the world as a sacrament in a post-mortem festschrift for Dennis Edwards, whom I mentioned yesterday. I think that everything has the capacity to become a sacrament. And at least we are not to say that it's not possible. But now you asked about, say, the Eucharist. Then for me, and here I think I'm representing Luther's point, the point is that the sacrament, according to Luther, is where Christ has promised to be present for us. And then he argues, as bread and wine. So he is then speaking not of a transubstantiation, but of a consubstantiation, or rather, this is not Luther himself, but this is later Lutheran tradition that wanted to distantiate themselves to take distance from Catholic Eucharistic theology, which is actually very close, I think. But Luther's point is, in order for this to make sense, which is something specific about the Eucharist and baptism and so on, because it is given with a promise of Christ, the Word. This only makes sense if Christ is already there. So the so-called ubiquity of Christ, not just as a spiritual principle, but as an embodied reality relating to in contact with this world, is very important. So Luther then makes some philosophical analogies to that. One is actually sound, again, resonance. I can now say something, all can hear it, if I speak clearly enough and slowly enough. So the same sound will be in many ears, and even the same meaning. Another example is Spiegel. A Spiegel is a mirror. A mirror, we have one mirror, I can see myself in one mirror, but then it breaks down in 1,000 pieces. And then I can take up a little piece of mirror and I can see myself in that little mirror. So everything is also in the small things. And then he mentioned in the end a crystal where the light comes in from all sides. And it is in German Christall, meaning Christ everywhere. That's at least my interpretation. So the point is that I think I've been inspired to do the deep incarnation thinking through Luther's Eucharistic theology, which says there needs to be an ubiquitous Christ, a Christ everywhere in the cosmos, as a precondition for God being present in this given by his word. And then we are back to the question that came up in the end from John, I think, yesterday. Isn't there a fourth term of sarx where the bread actually makes sense to me? And that is a possibility. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gregersen. This was wonderful. I'm glad to know, actually, that I don't have to choose between Martin Luther and Maximus the Confessor, so I'm very, very grateful for that.
Good.
You described Eco-3, I think the words you used were that humans are decentered and thereby recapacitated. Yeah. I'm thinking about Romans 8:19, where we hear that creation is groaning in anticipation for the revealing of the children of God. I wonder, that to me seems to imply that nature in a way is recentering us, that we are sort of being brought to the fore by those groanings of nature that are waiting for a unique revealing of us without us having to recenter ourselves. I'm just curious how that might weave into this picture.
You're right that if you read Romans 8 in this way, and it is that the nature is groaning and is awaiting for the fulfillment of humanity, so that it also can be saved, actually speaks of a centering of humanity by the mandate, in a sense, to be united with God, hence also uniting nature to God. So I think that's a very interesting idea. I had not thought about this in that way, but of course this text that you are mentioning is a very classic text about the interaction between nature and humanity in the New Testament. I will think more about that.
Do you mind one final question, just to bring this full circle with last night as well, and connecting to a very specific ecological movement? So my understanding is that deep incarnation is inspired in part by the deep ecology movement. And so that includes a political position, that includes principles like that the peripheral needs of humans shouldn't be set above the vital needs of other creatures. I wonder if you could just identify maybe one point of continuity for your work in deep incarnation with the deep ecology movement of
Yes.
Arne Naess and others, and perhaps one point of discontinuity.
Oh, thank you. That's very generous. Actually, deep incarnation has been, I used deep incarnation as a sort of a comparative model in my very early, when I took up again deep incarnation in 2010. So I have a section on deep incarnation and deep ecology. What deep ecology shares with, what deep incarnation shares with deep ecology is the sense that all things hang together and in a sense constitute a system where you cannot take things apart. So this is a little like this model that the alternative model to the modern constitution. What I then think is problematic is that it is a system-oriented ecology that in a sense does not have a sufficient understanding for the individual organism, human or not. So I think it's too grosso modo thinking, where you have to have everything. And I think we have to admit that many species die. It may also very well be that the human race will die. And I used to ask my students about this to some, just a very informally, and said, do you think that there will be a humanity in the year 2300? And this was a very unpleasant question, of course, in the morning. Then actually, all of them said yes. There were some who were not sure. Then I asked them, what will be the reason for the disappearance of humanity? Would it be climate change, or would it be an atomic war? And at that time, all the students said it would be climate change. Now we have Ukraine again. And I'm older than most of you here, so I've been living in this atomic threat at an existential level as a young child, 10, 12, 15 years, thinking about things. Maybe we'll be there again, but my point is only that we will all die as individuals, and we can also die as a species. So I think that I think that there's something to take care for. I think there's something to take care for the human species as there is for other species. But no one of us are here to stay. Certainly not as individuals, but probably not also as species. But I'm not prophet.
Let's thank our lecturer one last time.
Thank you very much.
Join us again tomorrow at noon Pacific time for our third and final lecture in the series, Living in a World of Shocks and Resilience Toward a Theology of Disasters. So, two final quick announcements. One is, if you've enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like more of this kind of engagement, we'd encourage you to check out our summer programs at Regent College as well as our degree programs here. I'd particularly like to highlight the Master of Arts in Leadership, Theology, and Society, which is a cohort-based master's. So the beauty of this is that you can remain in your full-time job and come to be on campus in a short-term residency 4 times during the year. So you can continue your work as a scientist, you can continue your work as a business person, and get engagement like this at the college. So if you'd like more details about that, check out rgnt.net. That's rgnt.net. Along with tomorrow's lecture, I'll invite you now to meet Professor Gregersen if you'd be interested in that. He'll be at the bookshop along with some of his books on display. I think his Incarnation book sold out yesterday, but there are still a couple of titles remaining, and more may have come in, we'll see. But you can come and chat with him further about tonight's topics. Thank you again for joining us and for your attention tonight.